before I get started, I mean, I believe I've said hi to almost everybody, but just in case I haven't, in case I have not had the joy of introducing myself, my name is Kyle. I am the youth pastor here. My wife and I run the youth ministry here at Christian Life Center. And I get the honor and the privilege to speak a little bit today while Pastor Randall is on a well-deserved vacation. He does a lot for us, and he deserves a little bit of time to breathe. Now, today, as I've been kind of let off my youth pastor leash and get to hang out with you guys today, I like to just kind of start things off with a little bit of a story. Now, this was, I believe it was a couple of years ago. My memory is not the best. I will be the first to admit that. Erica is usually the brains of the operation. I am just the one who does the talking and the standing in front of people, because this part doesn't bother me as much. But I believe it was a couple of years ago. Our family was driving around town a little bit, and my kids kind of shout from the back seat of, so that stuff that's written on the wall, what was that called again? And I have to go through this conversation of what graffiti is. And we start talking, and the question kind of comes up of, well, isn't that illegal? Isn't that a bad thing? Well, yeah. But the graffiti said, "I heart Jesus." And so then we had to have that conversation of, like, yes, it's important to share your faith, but doing it by breaking a law is not really the right way to do it, because as my kids so generously pointed out, there's a little bit of an issue trying to share Jesus' love while doing it in a fashion that does not share the light and the truth of Jesus. And so we had a bit of a long conversation on that, and it was a good conversation, kind of funny to me that this all sparked off of somebody deciding to use a spray paint can to share that they love Jesus. But that started making me think of just some funny things. I don't know if any of you guys follow some of the goofy things that are out there, but certain laws across this country are just downright funny, like funny ha-ha. Because I found just a few in our state alone, but there's actually entire YouTube channels dedicated to this if you're really feeling like going down a rabbit trail. But just a few from the state of Washington that I thought were quite entertaining. Did you know, over in the wonderful city of Everett, it is on paper illegal to display a hypnotized person in a storefront window? Why that had to be written, I kind of want to know the backstory, but I don't know the backstory. But the fact that had to be written down on paper, that is not okay, makes me kind of question things. Now, over in King County, the actual metro service, Metro Transit, on paper, the drivers have the discretion that they are allowed to refuse service to anyone let me read this. Metro Transit allows their drivers to refuse service to anyone whose body odor is unreasonably disturbing to other riders. Again, that just kind of reminds me that maybe we should take care of ourselves before we hop on a bus. One of the other funny ones that actually that is by far my favorite on this list, if we head south and we're down in Skamania County, down on the Columbia, for those of you that Skamania is kind of a weird location. But Skamania County passed a law back in 1969. So 57 years ago, this was put on the books, and it's still on the books today. It is a gross misdemeanor to harass or kill Bigfoot, which is punishable by up to 10 years in prison. 10 years in prison for harassing or killing Bigfoot. All right then, note to self. I've heard of some interesting ones when it comes to hunting laws, but never Bigfoot. Now, there is a law that I then read, and instead of funny ha-ha, it kind of makes you go funny weird. Funny makes you think. And this one is on the books. It was written back in 1909. So this is quite a bit older of a law. But this is Washington State Law RCW 40.54.050, and I believe there might actually be a slide for this one. But it reads, "Every person who shall willfully expose himself or herself to another, or any animal affected with any contagious or infectious disease in any public space," and it goes on to say, "shall be guilty of a misdemeanor." Now, this was written, like I said, in 1909 during a smallpox outbreak in the Northwest. And 1909 and smallpox meant like this is a deadly time. Those lawmakers wanted to protect people from a very deadly disease. But the letter of the law specifically states any contagious or infectious disease. So where does a cold land? A cold is something that is contagious. So by the letter of the law, technically, anyone who knowingly decides to go grocery shopping while they have a cold could be charged with a misdemeanor. This one being a simple misdemeanor, meaning up to 90 days in jail and a $1,000 fine. Now, truly, has anybody ever been charged for having a cold in public? I'm going to assume I am not the only person in this room who has done that on more than one occasion. But I doubt that anybody's ever been charged for that they've actually had to serve their 90 days in jail, that they've got their $1,000 fine. Because that's not really the heart of the law. The heart of the law was to protect people, to protect them from a deadly disease. It was there to keep people safe. It's not trying to punish you for going and buying cough drops when you have a sore throat. That then makes me question, what matters more? Following the law to the letter or following the heart of the law? Now, today, I'm going to end up talking about the cleansing of the temple, and it's something that many of you, I would believe most all of us, have heard about the cleansing of the temple that Jesus does. And we're going to get there. That is kind of the focal point, and that's something out of Matthew. But before we jump to that, I wanted to look a little bit further in the past, because the idea of cleansing the temple didn't just happen once. This wasn't something that only Jesus did. And even in Jesus' time on earth, we see a couple of different times that he does this. But looking back into the Old Testament, in 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 16 through 19, we're reading about King Josiah. And Josiah, for those of you that don't recall, Josiah was the 8-year-old king. He was the one that was king at 8 years old, and he reigns for a while. And this occurrence happens in his 18th year of being king. And it's when he discovers a book of the law. The law of the Lord had been hidden away from the people of Israel for quite some time at this point. And things haven't been going so well for them. Verse 16 says, "This is what the Lord says, I am going to bring disaster on this place and its people, according to everything written in the book of the king of Judah has read. Because they have forsaken me and burned incense to other gods and aroused my anger by all the idols their hands have made, my anger will burn against this place and will not be quenched. Tell the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says concerning the words you have heard. Because your heart was responsive and you humbled yourself before the Lord, when you heard what I have spoken against this place and its people, that they would become a curse and be laid waste, and because you tore your robes and wept in my presence, I also have heard you, declares the Lord." Now, at that moment, again, King Josiah had heard that God was going to tear down the kingdom of Judah, and he recognizes that this is going to be a problem. But we skip just a little further into chapter 23, and this is where Josiah does something about it. Verse 4 says, "The king ordered Hilkiah the high priest, the priests next in rank, and the doorkeepers to remove from the temple of the Lord all the articles made for Baal and Asherah and all the starry hosts. He burned them outside Jerusalem in the fields of the Kidron Valley and took the ashes to Bethel. He did away with the idolatrous priests appointed by the king of Judah to burn incense on the high places of the towns of Judah and on those around Jerusalem. Those who burned incense to Baal, to the sun and moon, to the constellations, and to all the starry hosts. He took the Asherah pole from the temple of the Lord to the Kidron Valley outside Jerusalem and burned it there. He ground it to powder and scattered the dust over the graves of the common people. Josiah brought all the priests from the towns of Judah and desecrated the high places from Geba to Beersheba, where the priests had burned incense. He broke down the gateway at the entrance of the gate of Joshua, the city governor, which was on the left of the city gate. He pulled down the altars the kings of Judah had erected on the roof near the upper room of Ahaz. The altars of Manasseh had built in the two courts of the temple of the Lord. He removed them from there, smashed them to pieces, and threw the rubble into the Kidron Valley. Josiah heard all of the things that his father and his father and just his ancestors had been doing against God. Josiah took it upon himself to cleanse the temple. He followed what God had told him to do. He was obedient in cleaning out the temple of the Lord. Now, that wasn't the only time in the Old Testament. You also have 2 Chronicles, where you have King Hezekiah, who cleans the temple. And that happens in 2 Chronicles, where he says, "Our parents were unfaithful. They did evil in the eyes of the Lord our God and forsook him. They turned their faces away from the Lord's dwelling place and turned their backs on him. This is why our fathers have fallen by the sword and why our sons and daughters and our wives are in captivity. Now I intend to make a covenant with the Lord, the God of Israel, so that his fierce anger will turn away from us. My sons, do not be negligent now, for the Lord has chosen you to stand before him and serve him, to minister before him and to burn incense." Verse 15 then says, "When they had assembled their fellow Levites and consecrated themselves, they went in to purify the temple of the Lord, as the king had ordered, following the word of the Lord." Hezekiah also, out of his obedience, cleansed the temple. Things weren't going right for that entire kingdom, but specifically, all of these offenses were happening in the temple of the Lord. So out of obedience, both Josiah and Hezekiah had the opportunity to cleanse the temple. Now, one of the things that I noticed there is that in Jesus' age, in the time of Jesus, as he's walking the earth, those two stories, Josiah and Hezekiah, would have already been written down. Those are stories that the people of Israel would have already known. They would have heard about people cleansing the temple throughout history. This is the idea that we see Jesus come through and do what Jesus does wouldn't actually be new to their minds. The people of Israel would know that people and that prophets and that kings come through and will cleanse the temple when necessary. The occasion that I'm going to really spend a little more time on is definitely the more famous of the temple cleansings, and we see it in every single gospel. We see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we see Jesus cleansing the temple towards the end of his earthly ministry. And in John, we see him cleansing the temple at the beginning of his earthly ministry. There's lots of theological debate and still lots of scholarly debate regarding if those two occurrences are two separate things or if they are the same one, just told at different parts of the story or different timelines of their own story. But really, that's not the important part of what I wanted to discuss. So before I jump into that, I believe that I've got a little bit of a schematic of the temple. Now, in Jesus' time, all of the Israelites would have been going to the Herodian temple, or King Herod's temple. And Herod has his own little bit of a backstory where he is actually not a full-blood Jew, but he's also not entirely respected by the Romans. So Herod himself does a lot of things where he's trying to kind of fuzz that line and be a bit of an ambassador between the Roman government and the Israelite people. But the reason I wanted this up here is because while it's hard to read all of the small components, we can see pretty quickly how things are separated. Things are intentionally broken apart. There are different areas for different things to occur. That wonderful tall building, that would be the holy place. And inside of the holy place was an even smaller location called the Holy of Holies. And that is where the Spirit of God dwelt. And inside the holy place, only priests were allowed to go in. And you would have had sacrifices being made just outside the holy place and brought in. But that smaller courtyard that surrounded the holy place is considered the Israelite courtyard. That location was reserved for the Israelite men specifically. Women would not have been allowed in there at all, and only the Israelites, the people who were born into the family of God, the people that were born into the Israelite community, would be allowed in that space. The larger courtyard off to the right there, that's the women's courtyard. So that area would be reserved for the Israelite women. But again, Israelites only. So inside those large walls, inside the safety of the walls, that was your Israelites. Outside of that, you see multiple gates, but the space that's really in conversation is this whole area outside, and that's called the Gentiles' courtyard. That would be the place that anybody who wanted to worship the God of Israel would be allowed to go. And that location, surrounding all of the walls, would have been the space that most historians and most scholars believe we would see Jesus cleansing the temple. That's the space that is kind of the pass-through. If you were one of the religious leaders of the day, in order to get into the Israelite courtyard, you would have made your presence definitely known. You would have walked through the Gentile courtyard to make your way into the space. And this is a place that before Jesus comes and does what Jesus does, my mind keeps picturing places like Pike's Place Market over in Seattle, if anybody's ever been over there visiting and seeing fish being thrown, or if you have ever spent any time in like New York City, lots of noise, lots of people, because that would be a place that anybody would be allowed to go. You would have just the exchanging of money, and thinking all metallic money, so everything's going to be noisy and jingly. There was also animals that were being sold. John's gospel includes large animals like livestock, and specifically oxen and sheep are mentioned. The other gospels mention specifically all the birds. So you're going to have all of the animals and the smells and the noises that are associated with them. You have the noise and the chaos of just a large group of people. And as I'm saying these words, I myself am already getting like sensory overload. And I can just imagine what that would have been like walking into that place with just a lot of people, a lot of noises, lots of smells, just all of the things happening all at one time. But then Jesus walks in. And in Matthew chapter 21, verses 12 and 13, it says, "Then Jesus went into the temple of God and drove out all those who bought and sold in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it into a den of thieves.'" Church, this is the part of Jesus that some people don't tend to like. They don't like to be reminded that there is the side of Jesus that can get into a bit of righteous anger. Jesus walking in and flipping tables, especially if you are on the school of thought that you've got two different occurrences, that's not abnormal. Jesus walking in and seeing the injustice, seeing people taking advantage of other people, people seeing that we're now bartering right outside of where we're supposed to be worshiping God, that would be like taking our lobby and filling it with people trying to sell things all day. And as we walk in and the noise wouldn't have stopped as you walk in to come in to worship, it would be a large distraction. It would be putting up both a barrier of attention, but also a barrier of like a physical barrier, because you would have had tables and people all over the place. And Jesus gets angry about it. We even notice in John's gospel when he also mentions that Jesus forms a whip of cords. Jesus doesn't like go over and gently ask the sellers and say, "Excuse me, sir, but I'm going to need to ask you to leave." Like he doesn't walk up to them and say, "You're not really doing this right, so I'm going to need you to go." Jesus fashions a whip of cords and is actively driving them out. I can picture the chaos of that too, of people running, because you now have a guy cracking a whip and throwing your tables and all your stuff all over everywhere, because that's not what the temple is for. That's not at all what the temple was for. It wasn't to sell things. It wasn't to allow people to take care of other people, or to take advantage of other people. I'm sorry. So that brings me to question, why exactly were there birds there in the first place? Like, the idea of doves being for sale, that part is actually sort of biblical, sort of okay. Back to the heart of the law idea here. Because under Levitical law, doves are an acceptable offering. Doves and pigeons were allowed as a burnt offering, as a sin offering. But there's a little bit of a caveat to that. The birds were meant to be the affordable option. I kind of think of like what we see in a lot of doctors' offices, a lot of dentists' office, things like that, where you have that sliding pay scale. If you can afford it, they will charge you X. But if that is too much, they still want to make sure that you are healthy, so they will take what you make and adjust your payment accordingly. God did the same thing. God made a way. God made an acceptable offering for people who were poor, people who were new mothers, people that were actively unclean, so they weren't supposed to be around other people. So he made sure that no one was shut out of his presence. But people did what people do. People saw an opportunity. And that's where we see that corruption come up. People noticed, well, I have the really good ability to catch a lot of birds. And then those people over there, they're kind of struggling to get the birds. So maybe I sell them the birds, and then I make a little bit of money. They get their sacrifice that they need to make. And that may or may not have started off somewhat innocently, but it turned into something so much more. The part that really convicts me a bit is that these sacrifices that were supposed to be being made were just that. They were a personal sacrifice. They would have taken some work. They would have taken a little bit of, I don't want to give this up type of mentality. I don't want to give this up, but God says I need to, and God's going to take care of this, so I'm going to. Should have been the mentality. But now you have a whole market outside of the temple, making it really easy for those of you for those people that were traveling to say, well, I really didn't want to bring my oxen all the way down here, so what I'll do is I'll travel light, and I'll get there, and then I'll just buy some birds, and then I'll sacrifice the birds. What was meant to be a personal sacrifice, something that actually took some effort, was able to become a convenience purchase. Like that candy bar at the end of your grocery shopping off the side of the shelf because, oh yeah, I forgot I kind of, I guess, need that. But that wasn't what it was supposed to be. And it turned into something that was really profitable for the sellers. Again, the sacrifices that Jesus was looking for, the sacrifices that were demanded back far earlier in the Levitical law, were meant to be personal. They were meant to be a sacrifice, not something that's just overly convenient. Now, the very next verse after the flipping of the tables is a part that really kind of hit home for me. Because we often stop. We stop talking about the story of Jesus flipping tables right where I stopped, right at the end of 13, where he just says, you've made it a den of thieves. That's often where most people do stop, because that alone is powerful. But the very next verse, I think, holds as much, if not a little bit more power, and a lot of it really comes down to the very next word. Verse 14 says, then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. That single verse by itself is really loaded. That single word, then the blind and the lame came to him in the temple. Church, before Jesus pushed these people out, like I said, it would be full of noise. It would have been full of people. It would have been full of tables and animals and just commerce, just a bunch of chaos. And in the middle of all of that, you would have seen the important people at the front and center of all of it. And the people who were blind, the people who were lame, the people who were vulnerable, they would have been being pushed out. They would have been pushed to the edges. And once Jesus drove out the thieves, that allowed the blind and the lame and the vulnerable to come in and receive what he had for them. First, there's the cleansing. Jesus does the cleansing. Jesus pushes the bad things out. And then comes the healing. Just like we saw with Josiah and Hezekiah, first the cleansing of the temple, first getting rid of the bad things, and then Jesus heals. So I beg the question, what healing is waiting for you on the other side of your obedience? As we let Jesus in to do the cleansing, what healing is waiting for you on the other side of that? What healing is going to come in after Jesus does his cleansing? Church, from Eden onward, from the beginning of time, what God has asked for has been our obedience. Not robotic rule following. We don't have to follow exactly the letter of the law, per se. But our obedience needs to be rooted in love. When asked what were the two, or when asked what the most important commandment was, Jesus summarized the entire law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are something that we all have probably heard plenty of times. And that's when Jesus says all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Church, if it was about following exactly letter of the law and you had to do exactly word for word what the law said, I think we would all fail. I mean, just in the Levitical law, there were over 600 laws written in the Bible that we could go back and refer to. And I can guarantee that all of us have broken at least a couple of those. It's not about the letter of the law. It's all about the heart of the law. And that heart of the law is about love. Loving God with our heart. Loving God with all of our soul. Loving God with all of our mind. Then, loving our neighbor as ourself. And what does that really look like today? Is that something where we're making sure our neighbor has everything they need? Are we making sure that our neighbor is understanding that Jesus loves them? And I guess that also begs the question, who is our neighbor? I mean, Jesus says a lot about that as well. But your neighbor is everybody. Like we all have a circle of influence. We have people around us that we encounter that we are called to love like ourselves. In church, I talked about cleansing the temple first, and then healing would come. We're not necessarily talking about this building. We're not only talking about this building. We, each of us, are the temple. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians in a couple of different locations. 1 Corinthians 3:16, he says, "Don't you know that you yourselves are God's temple, and that God's Spirit dwells within your midst?" He also goes on to say in 1 Corinthians 6:19, "Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. You are not your own." We are the temple. Each of us, each of you, me, we are the temple of God. And Jesus is still cleansing temples today. Jesus is still cleansing us today. Jesus is still coming through and flipping tables today. Those tables, for us, they may not include money and oxen and doves, but the tables that Jesus is flipping inside of his temple, pride, bitterness, shame, fear, secret sin of any type, self-sufficiency, unforgiveness. There's so many things that Jesus is clearing out of each of us. Jesus isn't just flipping tables, but Jesus is also driving out thieves. When we consider who our enemy is, he has come to steal, kill, and destroy. Jesus is driving out the thief of our peace, the thief of our joy, the thief of our patience, the thief of our identity, the thief of our own callings. Jesus is driving out the thief of our intimacy with him. He is driving the enemy out. He is driving the thief out. He's flipping tables inside of each of us. But truly, we have to let him. Because if Jesus is cleansing our temple, if Jesus is taking the tables that are inside of us and flipping them, all of the stuff going scattered everywhere, and we're over here picking up the pieces and putting them back on the table, and we're picking up the shame that he's already cleared out, and we're picking up the fear that he's already cleared out, and we're putting it back on the table, are we letting him clear out our temple? Are we giving him space to move? Are we giving him room to grow each of us? Are we giving him room to grow our love for one another? What does Jesus need to cleanse in your temple today? What space is he trying to move? What space is he trying to make so that we can love better? And why? Why do we need to let him do that? We need to let him do that because once the temple is cleansed, then healing will enter. Once the temple is cleansed, love can grow. Once the temple is cleansed, that's when we see the blind, the lame, the poor, the least of these can come close to God, can come close to Jesus. Jesus cleanses the temple so that the love of God, so that we can love God fully, but he also cleanses the temple so that we can love people freely. Jesus is coming and he's trying to make room for us to love. So I ask you today, and these are a handful of reflection questions. But I really want you to take this away today. What does Jesus need to cleanse in your temple today? What noise, what distraction, what chaos, what marketplace has drowned out the voice of God in your life? What things are going on that are not allowing you to see him? What thief is he driving out? What's the thing that you are struggling with that you've invited God in and he's forcing that thing out, but maybe you're still standing there picking up the pieces, wanting that little bit of comfort because that's what you know is that thing. But more importantly, what healing is waiting for you? That thing that's on your table that Jesus is casting out, he's got a healing from that for you. He's got the replacement for that thing for you. And are we excited to see what that's going to be? If you're the one who is struggling with doubt or struggling with fear, and you're not letting him push that out all the way, we should be excited to see what he's got in store for us instead. When that thing that is holding us back is gone, he's got something for us that is so much better. I would like to take a very short moment, and as the worship team plays, we can just spend a moment in reflection. Because God is trying to make space in each of us to love not only him, but so that we can love others. And that's going to look different for each of us. So if you wouldn't mind, bow your heads, and we're just going to pray for a second. Lord, I pray that you would flip tables in hearts today, that we would allow you to move in a way that only you could. Lord, I pray that you would drive out the things that are holding us back, the things that are taking up the space in our hearts, the things that are replacing where you should be. Lord, I pray that you would be glorified in every breath that we take, in the things that we do as we speak to our friends, as we speak to our neighbors, that we would love on them the way that you love us. Lord, I thank you that you have always been faithful, that you have always been good. And Lord, I pray that as you drive out what doesn't belong, that you would bring in the things that we're missing, the things that only you can bring in. I pray that you would fill us with that hope, with that joy, with peace. Lord, thank you for who you are, and thank you for your faithfulness. In your mighty name, amen.